The night had teeth. Up on the ridgeline, 12 soldiers clung to the rocks, each breath a battle against the dust choking the air. Mortar rounds thumped in the distance, each one closer than the last. The sky was a dead black curtain, shredded only by the flash of tracer fire arcing across the valley. Every muzzle flash below revealed shadows closing in, 3 sides tightening like a noose, the 4th side a sheer cliff that promised nothing but a long fall to a hard end. The team's rifles barked in short, disciplined bursts, but their ammo was running thin. The medic was out of morphine. Harris was bleeding out, his leg a ruin. And somewhere behind them, Reyes swore under his breath as the barrel of his SAW began to glow red from overuse. They'd called for air support once already. No answer. Called again. Static. Finally, the radio operator gritted his teeth and sent the last transmission into the void, his voice cracking with exhaustion. And he callsign. This is Viper 2-1. We are pinned. Multiple hostiles. We need air support. Now. No one expected a reply. Not here. Not this far from the main grid. In a room full of commanders miles away, the request would already be filed under too late. Cole felt it in his bones. They had maybe 15 minutes before the enemy overran their position. He chambered another round, eyes fixed on the tree line below. And then he heard it. At first, it was faint, buried under the noise of the fight, a low, rhythmic pulse that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. Not the scream of a jet, not the thin whine of a drone. This was deeper, heavier, alive. Rotor blades. From the darkness beyond the valley, a shadow slid into view, low and fast. No running lights, no radio calls, just a dark predator moving with intent. As it broke over the ridge, the angular shape became clear. Stub wings loaded with hellfires, a 30mm chain gun hanging like a clenched fist. An AH-64 Apache. It didn't announce itself, didn't ask for coordinates. It simply lined up its first target. And in that moment, every man on that ridge realized the last call they'd made wasn't going to be answered by a squadron or a flight of 2. It was going to be answered by one pilot, one machine, and not a single word. Welcome back to The Storyscape. Before we dive in, I have to ask, where are you watching from today? Let me know in the comments, because your stories, your perspectives, they shape the way we tell ours. And if this is your first time here, this is the place where we bring you cinematic, high-stakes stories of courage, impossible odds, and the people who step forward when no one else can. The valley lay under a blanket of darkness so thick that even the moonlight couldn't pierce it. The only illumination came in violent fleeting bursts, the sharp arcs of tracer fire cutting across the ridge, the sudden bloom of an RPG's backblast, the dull orange flare of a burning truck down in the ravine. The air was heavy with dust and cordite, the kind of air that sticks in your throat and makes every breath feel like swallowing metal. On the ridge, 12 men from Viper 2-1 crouched behind jagged rock, their rifles braced against the dirt, scanning the shadows for movement. Every time the enemy fired, their night vision goggles lit up with the green phantoms of advancing silhouettes. 3 sides. That's where they were coming from. A slow, methodical tightening of the noose. The 4th side was a sheer drop 50 meters into the ravine, the kind of drop you didn't survive unless you wanted to be found in pieces. Staff Sergeant Cole wiped a streak of sweat from his cheek and glanced at the ammo bag. Half empty. No grenades left. The medic had already used the last morphine syringe on Corporal Harris, whose leg was a ruin of blood and torn fabric. The smell of iron was thick in the dirt. "Any call sign. This is Viper 2-1, the radio operator whispered into the handset. his voice barely steady. Static crackled, swallowing half his words. "We are pinned. Heavy contact. Need air support now." He didn't bother with grid coordinates. If anyone was listening, the sounds of gunfire and the constant pop of incoming mortars would tell them enough. Miles away, in a command tent glowing with harsh white light, generals and operations officers leaned over a table covered in maps and screens. The transmission was faint, broken, but it was clear enough. A special forces unit was about to be overrun. Protocol dictated that they'd push the request up the chain, get a strike package approved, deconflict the airspace, identify targets, verify coordinates, and then, maybe, if everything lined up, a pair of fast movers would be overhead in 45 minutes. Viper 2-1 didn't have 45 minutes. On the ridge, Cole felt the earth shudder as another mortar hit 30 feet away, showering them with dirt and pebbles. Harris groaned, his hands clutching his thigh. The team's saw gunner, Reyes, opened up with a 3-second burst, the barrel of his weapon glowing faintly in the dark. He wasn't shooting to kill anymore, he was shooting to keep their heads down. Then it happened. At first, Cole thought it was just another incoming round, a deep, resonant thump in the distance. But the sound didn't fade. It grew, layered with a low, rhythmic pulse that seemed to vibrate in the ribcage. Not the scream of a jet engine, not the high whine of a drone. This was slower, heavier. Rotor blades. They weren't overhead yet, but every man on that ridge felt the change in the air. The enemy fire faltered for just a moment, as if they too had recognized the sound. From the black horizon, a shape emerged, at first no more than a shadow, gliding low over the treetops. No running lights, no strobe, just a dark predator slipping in under the cover of night. The outline sharpened as it drew closer, the angular fuselage, the downward tilted rotors, the long, thin wings bristling with Hellfire missiles. An AH-64 Apache. No one on Viper 2-1 had called it in. No one even knew Apaches were in the area tonight. Yet here it was, silent but for the deep thump of its rotors moving with the patience of a hunter. The first missile streaked away before anyone had time to cheer. It arced into the darkness, and a second later, an enemy gun nest on the far slope vanished in a thunderclap of fire and shrapnel. The ridge shook. The men ducked instinctively, then lifted their heads, realizing the fire wasn't aimed at them. Whoever was flying this thing wasn't just hitting targets, it was surgically removing the enemy's advantage. The gunner's chain cannon opened up, the sound like the tearing of the night itself, a brutal percussive roar that drowned out every other noise. The rounds chewed through the enemy's forward position, dirt and rock exploding in fountains of dust under the muzzle flashes. Cole grabbed the radio. "Whoever you are, keep doing that," he shouted into the static, half laughing in disbelief. But there was no reply. Not a call sign, not a Roger, not even static. The Apache simply banked left, presenting its broadside to the enemy, and unleashed another wave of fire. Down in the valley, the advancing silhouettes scattered, some diving for cover, others simply vanishing under the blast radius. It was in that moment, as the rotor wash whipped dust into their eyes and the battlefield lit up in flashes of fire, that the men of Viper 2-1 realized this wasn't standard air support. This was something else entirely. The Apache moved like it had a mind of its own, not in the rigid, predictable patterns Cole had seen from other gunships, but in fluid, almost instinctive sweeps. It hugged the contours of the ridgeline, dipping low behind a spur of rock before bursting out on the other side in a perfectly timed strike. The nose-mounted sensor turret tracked every movement below, swiveling with mechanical precision, yet somehow it felt aware, as though the pilot's eyes were seeing more than what was on the infrared feed. Through the green haze of his NVGs, Cole caught glimpses of the enemy scattering into gullies trying to melt into the darkness, but they weren't fast enough. The Apache's 30mm chain gun spat controlled bursts, each one hammering a target with such accuracy
that Cole could hear the delayed thump of rounds punching into dirt seconds after seeing the muzzle flash. No wasted ammunition.
No random spraying. Every round had a purpose. Reyes, crouched beside him, muttered, "That's not a rookie flying that thing." The gunship swung wide to the east, rotors chopping the thin mountain air, then leveled out for a moment, long enough for two hellfires to streak off the wing pylons. Cole watched their exhaust trails curve gracefully, each missile banking in midair before slamming into separate machine gun positions. The explosions tore through the night like thunderclaps, followed by the eerie silence that comes when an enemy realizes they've just lost their teeth. Still, the radio was dead quiet. No commands, no requests for confirmation. Whoever this was, they didn't need someone on the ground painting targets or feeding coordinates. They already knew. The medic, still working frantically on Harris, looked up a second. "You think that's—" He didn't finish the sentence, as if saying it out loud might make the thought too real. Cole didn't answer. His focus was locked on the Apache's maneuvers. It was holding position now, using its thermal imaging to sweep the tree line. Then the cannon opened up again, ripping into a pocket of heat signatures hiding behind a cluster of rocks. The burst was short, just enough to flatten the cover, and then the gunship shifted to hover over the valley floor. And that's when Cole saw it, a small emblem painted just below the cockpit, half hidden in shadow. He couldn't make out the details, but the shape was distinctive. A stylized falcon, diving with talons extended. It triggered something in his memory, a conversation he'd overheard years ago about a pilot who didn't take assignments, but appeared when she chose to. The Apache banked again, passing low enough that the rotor wash blasted grit into Cole's face. He coughed, shielded his eyes, and felt the vibration of the blades in his chest. For a second, he thought he caught sight of the pilot through the armored glass, just a shadowed figure, helmet visor down, posture steady as stone. And then the helicopter rolled back toward the valley, nose dipping into another attack run. Down below, enemy reinforcements were arriving, at least two technicals kicking up dust as they climbed the narrow track toward the fight. The Apache didn't hesitate. One hellfire streaked out, finding the lead truck in a burst of fire. The second technical swerved wildly, trying to back down the slope, but a burst from the chain gun shredded its engine block and sent it sliding sideways into the ravine. The enemy's return fire was scattered, panicked. RPG trails lit the air sporadically, but the Apache stayed low and fast, weaving in patterns that made it almost impossible to draw bead. One rocket streaked close enough for Cole to see the flare of its warhead, but the pilot rolled the gunship into a sharp bank, letting the round pass harmlessly into the hillside. It was surgical, relentless, and utterly without wasted motion. The men of Viper 2-1 were still in the fight, returning fire where they could, but for the first time in hours, they weren't simply holding out, they were advancing. Reyes fired a burst to cover two teammates as they crawled to a better position. The medic managed to get Harris stabilized enough to move, and through it all, the Apache prowled overhead, dismantling the enemy's assault piece by piece. Finally, the last of the mortar crews went silent under a burst of cannon fire. The hillside that had been alive with muzzle flashes was now still, just drifting smoke and the faint glow of burning wreckage. Cole lowered his rifle, listening. Nothing. No shouts, no return fire. Only the deep, steady chop of rotor blades as the Apache hovered one last time over the battlefield. Cole reached for the radio, hoping to finally hear a voice on the other end. "This is Viper 2-1, he said into the handset, his tone carrying a rare mix of exhaustion and gratitude. "Whoever you are, you saved us tonight." Static. Then, without a word, the Apache nosed up, banked toward the west, and disappeared into the night. The ridge was quiet now, but it was the wrong kind of quiet. Not the peaceful stillness that comes after a mission is complete, This was a silence heavy with questions, the kind that pressed down on a man's chest and made him listen for things that weren't there. Cole stood at the edge of the rock shelf, scanning the horizon with his NVGs. Nothing but darkness beyond the burning wrecks below. No heat signatures moving, no rotors in the distance. It was as if the Apache had never been there at all. But it had been there. Every man on Viper 2-1 could still feel the rotor wash on their skin, still hear the deep, rhythmic chop of blades in their bones. They'd all seen the precision of those strikes, the way the gunship seemed to know exactly where every hostile was, as if it had been watching the battlefield long before anyone made that desperate call. Reyes slung his saw over his shoulder and came to stand beside Cole. "You notice?" Cole kept scanning. "Notice what?" "That bird didn't squawk once. No IFF, no tail number we could read, and no chatter." Cole lowered the NVGs, blinking into the night. "Yeah, I noticed." They both knew what that meant. In normal operations, an AH-64 in friendly airspace would be running identification friend or foe transmitters, standard radio calls, mission check-ins, the whole protocol tree. Tonight, nothing. Whoever was flying that Apache wasn't on anyone's roster.
The medic limped over, Harris leaning heavily on his shoulder. "You think she's one of ours?" he asked. His voice carried that same hesitant tone from earlier, the kind you use when you're afraid the answer might change how you see the world. Cole didn't answer right away. He remembered the glimpse of the Falcon emblem beneath the cockpit, stylized, almost tribal in design. He'd seen it once before years ago, in a dimly lit hangar in Kandahar. Back then, it had been on the nose of a heavily weathered Apache parked at the far end of the tarmac. The pilot who flew it had a reputation that bordered on myth. They called her Ghost. No one seemed to know her real name. She didn't fly scheduled missions. She didn't attend briefings. She appeared in the AO without warning, hit her targets with surgical brutality, and vanished. No debrief, no paperwork trail. The stories were always the same. She showed up when the odds were impossible, when there was no one else left to call. Most wrote her off as a legend, an invention of soldiers swapping stories to keep the darkness at bay. But Cole remembered hearing a different account from a ranger he trusted, a man who swore he'd once been pulled out of a kill zone by an Apache that moved exactly like the one they'd seen tonight. The same silent approach, the same refusal to speak over comms, and the same falcon painted beneath the cockpit. Cole glanced back at the team. The relief on their faces was obvious, but so was the unease. Men didn't like mysteries in combat zones, not when lives were on the line. Yet this mystery had saved them. "Doesn't matter if she's ours," Cole said finally. "Matters that we're still breathing." Reyes gave a humorless chuckle. "I'll drink to that when we get out of here." They began moving down the slope, picking their way through the charred remains of enemy positions. The smell of burning fuel hung thick in the air, mingling with the acrid tang of scorched earth. Every so often, Cole caught himself scanning the sky, half expecting the Apache to reappear, but it didn't. Back at the extraction point, the radio crackled with the voice of a command post officer. "Viper 2-1, sit rep." Cole pressed the transmit button. "We're intact. 2 wounded, stabilized. Hostile forces neutralized." He hesitated, then added, "Air support was effective." There was a pause on the other end. "Negative, Viper. No air assets in your grid tonight." The words sank into the cold space between Cole's ribs. He looked at Reyes, who was already staring back at him. Neither spoke. "Say again, Command?" "Repeat. No air support assigned to your sector. Closest rotary wing assets are still 2 hours out. If you saw an aircraft, it wasn't one of ours."
Cole released the transmit button slowly, his thumb brushing over the pitted metal. The unease in his gut wasn't fear exactly. It was something sharper. Curiosity laced with the weight of having just crossed paths with something that wasn't supposed to exist. Somewhere out there in the darkness, beyond the range of their comms, that Apache was flying. No base to return to, no manifest to check off, just a set of coordinates, a mission that no one had assigned, and a pilot whose name would never appear in any official record. The story is called her Ghost. Cole was starting to understand why. The extraction bird was still 40 minutes out, and that was 40 minutes too long in terrain like this. The valley might have fallen silent, but everyone on Viper 2-1 knew that silence could shatter in an instant. Reinforcements, snipers, an ambush on the way out. It was never over until you were wheels up. Cole and Reyes took point as the team moved along a narrow goat path hugging the ridgeline. The night was cold now, the adrenaline ebbing enough for the chill to creep into their bones. Every sound carried, the crunch of boots on loose stone, the distant hiss of burning wreckage, Harris's labored breathing. But there was something else, too. A faint vibration in the air. It started as a feeling in Cole's chest, a low hum just at the edge of hearing. Then slowly, it grew into the unmistakable pulse of rotor blades. Reyes heard it at the same time. "No way," he muttered. Cole didn't answer. He knew that sound now, not just the rhythm, but the way it seemed to belong to the darkness around it. And it was coming in fast. They reached a bend in the path that overlooked the valley floor, and there it was, the Apache sliding in low over the treetops, with its running lights still dark. It was angled nose down, the way a predator stalks its prey before the strike. And below, in the open flat where the path snaked toward the LZ, a convoy of 3 technicals was pushing hard toward their route. Each had a mounted DSHK, heavy enough to chew through the side armor of the extraction bird. Cole swore under his breath. "They're moving to cut us off." The Apache made its move before he could say more. One hellfire dropped away from the pylon, the missile's motor flaring briefly before it curved into the lead truck. The detonation was brutal, not just a blast, but a shock wave that kicked dust up in a rolling wall and sent the other 2 vehicles fishtailing. The second truck tried to swing its gun toward the sky, but the chain gun answered before the barrel even elevated. A trite burst, no more than a second long, and the DSHK gunner crumpled over the mount. The last technical, engine roaring, tried to break off down a side track. The Apache didn't bother with missiles this time. It dropped into a shallow dive, hugging the terrain so closely that the rotor tips looked like they might catch on the trees, and swept a line of 30-millimeter fire straight through the truck from bumper to tailgate. The vehicle rolled to a stop, smoke billowing from its shattered hood. Cole couldn't help but notice, again, that every strike was measured. There was no spray and pray, no wasted ammunition. Each shot was exactly what was needed, nothing more. Reyes spoke without taking his eyes off the scene. "That's her signature. Minimal exposure, maximum kill ratio." Cole gave a small nod. He'd heard about this before, though always secondhand. The so-called signature strike. Not an official tactic, more like an art form. The pilot used it when she wanted to send a message. "I'm here, I see you, and you can't stop me." The convoy destroyed, the Apache swung wide and climbed slightly, hovering just long enough for the team to catch a glimpse of the Falcon emblem under the cockpit again. The paint caught a flicker of firelight from the wreckage below, its talons forever frozen in a strike. Still no radio call, still no acknowledgement. Cole keyed his mic anyway. "Viper 2-1 to..." He stopped, realizing he had nothing to call her. No call sign, no protocol, just a ghost in the sky. "To whoever's flying that bird, keep the skies clear until we're at the LZ." Nothing but static. And yet, as they began their final push toward the extraction point, the Apache moved ahead of them, shadowing their route like a watchful predator. Every 100 meters, it would pause, pivoting slightly as if scanning for movement. Once it broke left suddenly, disappearing behind a hill, and moments later, A single distant burst of gunfire echoed from beyond the ridge, followed by silence. Reyes shook his head. She is sweeping our flanks. Nobody's getting close without paying for it. By the time they reached the clearing designated for pickup, the Apache was already circling high enough to be out of small arms range. Cole could see the extraction bird inbound, a Black Hawk running with its lights off, hugging the contours. It flared for landing, kicking up a halo of dust around the team. As the men loaded Harris and the rest of their gear, Cole looked up one last time. The Apache had leveled out to the west, silhouetted briefly against the faint glow of the horizon. No pass over the team, no slow victory lap, just a quiet turn and a steady climb into the night. The Black Hawk's crew chief slapped Cole's shoulder, urging him aboard. He climbed in, took his seat, and as the rotors thumped overhead, he caught himself wondering if they'd just witnessed the last flight of a myth, or if somewhere, someday, Ghost would appear again. The ride back to base was the kind of flight where no one spoke unless absolutely necessary.
Not because they didn't have anything to say, but because each man was replaying the night in his head, trying to make sense of what had happened. The Black Hawk's cabin was dim, lit only by the faint glow of the instruments up front and the occasional flicker of light from outside. Harris was stretched out on a litter, the medic keeping pressure on his bandaged leg. Reyes sat across from Cole, his helmet tilted forward, hands clasped over his rifle. Cole's eyes drifted to the open side door. The desert stretched beneath them in a black sea, featureless except for the silver line of a distant river. Somewhere out there, Ghost's Apache was flying, maybe already miles away, maybe hovering low over another kill zone. He doubted he'd ever know for sure. They touched down at the forward operating base just before dawn. The light was cold and pale, spilling across the tarmac as the rotors wound down. A pair of MPs waited nearby to escort them straight to debrief. No showers, no hot food, just the standard post-mission grind. The debrief room was small, its walls bare except for a single map board. A major from S2 Intelligence sat at the head of the table, a legal pad in front of him. Behind him, a young captain typed into a laptop, ready to record every detail. "All right, Viper 2-1, the major began, his voice clipped and efficient. "Walk me through what happened after you reached the objective." Cole glanced at Reyes. They'd talked on the flight about whether to mention the Apache. It wasn't a matter of hiding it. It was a matter of whether the people in this room would even believe them. But he decided to stick to the truth. "We were pinned down by enemy forces from 3 sides," Cole began, outlining the firefight. He described the mortar impacts, the dwindling ammo, the desperate radio call. Then he paused, bracing for the part that would raise eyebrows. And then an AH-64 came in low from the east and engaged hostile positions, took out 3 technicals, multiple gun nests, and cleared our route to the LZ. The major looked up from his notes, his expression unreadable. "An Apache?" "Yes, sir." "Call sign?" Cole hesitated. "No call sign, no radio comms, no visible tail number." The captain's typing slowed. The major leaned back slightly in his chair. "Viper 2-1, there were no Apache gunships in your sector last night. Closest rotary wing asset was 80 miles away on a different tasking." Cole met his eyes without flinching.
With respect, sir, you're wrong. We saw it. We were standing under it. Without it, we wouldn't be here. The major's jaw tightened. He closed his notebook and gave a quick nod to the captain, who stopped typing altogether. "Debrief complete." Cole frowned. "That's it?" "That's it," the major said, standing. "Get your wounded to the med bay. Get the rest of your team squared away. As they filed out, Cole couldn't shake the feeling that something had just been buried. It wasn't the first time in his career that a detail had been quietly omitted from an official report, but this felt different. This wasn't about protecting operational security. This was about erasing something or someone from existence. Later, in the team's ready room, Reyes tossed his helmet onto a chair and muttered, "They knew." Cole looked up. What? They knew about her. That's why they shut it down. You saw the Major's face? He didn't hear something new. He heard something he's been told not to talk about. Cole didn't argue. He'd been thinking the same thing. That night, long after the base had gone quiet, Cole found himself in the ops center alone, leaning over a terminal. He pulled up flight records from the previous 24 hours. Every Apache mission was listed, each with call signs, coordinates, and timestamps. He scrolled through them twice. Nothing matched their grid. Nothing even close. Except there was one redacted entry. No call sign, no location. Just a blank field with a timestamp exactly 30 minutes before Ghost had arrived on their ridge. Access to the file was restricted, flagged as need to know. Cole stared at it for a long time, the cursor blinking beside the empty fields. He thought about the emblem under the cockpit, the way she'd flown without a word, the surgical precision of her strikes. And he thought about the way the Major had ended that debrief the second her name might have slipped into the record. Ghost wasn't a myth. She was real. And someone in the chain of command was making sure she stayed in the shadows. He waited for afterwards, just by scanning the air, looking for that angular silhouette. When they flew over hostile terrain, he'd scan the horizon for a dark shape moving without lights. Nothing. It wasn't until a late-night insertion, deep in contested territory, that anything changed. Viper 2-1 had been tasked with disabling a relay station used to coordinate mortar strikes against nearby villages. The approach was brutal. Narrow gullies, no cover, and the constant threat of ambush. They moved under the cover of darkness, taking the high route along a ridgeline that overlooked the objective. Halfway there, the team froze. Down in the valley, a patrol of enemy fighters was moving toward the station, heavily armed and in numbers that would make the assault impossible if they arrived first.
Cole was weighing their options, none of them good, when it happened. A low, steady pulse in the air. Not the chaotic beat of random rotors, but that same deep, measured rhythm he'd felt in his chest on the ridge. Reyes looked at him, eyes wide in the dark. No words were exchanged. None were needed. From the far side of the valley, an AH-64 slid into view, ghosting over the treetops with no running lights. Even at this distance, Cole saw the curve of the Falcon emblem under the cockpit, catching a sliver of moonlight. There was no roar of incoming rockets, no dramatic sweep. Ghost moved with the same deliberate patience as before, studying the patrol from an altitude that kept her out of range. Then, with surgical precision, she began to dismantle them. One Hellfire took the lead vehicle. A short burst from the chain gun scattered the fighters into cover, where a second missile found them seconds later. The survivors didn't regroup. They simply fled into the dark, abandoning their approach. The Apache hovered for a moment, as if confirming the field was clear. Then it banked sharply, tracing a wide arc that brought it closer to the ridgeline, where Viper 2-1 was crouched in the shadows. Cole couldn't help himself. He stood just enough to make his silhouette visible. The Apache slowed. For a few seconds that stretched into forever, the gunship hovered there, rotors thumping a rhythm that seemed to swallow the night. Cole could almost make out the pilot behind the glass, helmet visor glinting faintly. Then, just as before, There was no radio call, no acknowledgement. The Apache tilted its nose, rolled smoothly to the west, and vanished over the horizon. The rest of the mission went without incident. The relay station was destroyed, the team exfiltrated without a scratch, and the official report listed no air support assets utilized. Back at base, Cole sat alone outside the barracks, the desert night stretching endless above him. He thought about the fact that Ghost had shown up twice now, not on paper, not by request, but because she'd chosen to. And in both cases, she'd left without taking credit, without even leaving a voice on the comms. Somewhere, beyond the reach of flight logs and after-action reports, there was a pilot who moved through the sky like a shadow. Maybe she worked for someone. Maybe she worked for no one at all. But Cole knew this much. She was out there. And the next time someone made a desperate last call for air support, there was a chance she'd answer. Not with words, not with promises, just with the thump of rotor blades, the flash of a falcon's talons in the dark, and the kind of precision strike that turned hopeless fights into legends.